The last message of our series, Right Where You Are. And those of you watching online, we want to welcome you as well. We've covered a lot of territory in the last 4 weeks, and today I want to wrap it up. But it's really been about allowing God to use you right where you are. The first week I talked about calling, and then Scott talked about your place and your role. And then last week, Nick talked about how we are given gifts through the grace of God. And yet, for some of you, you're thinking, this is a little intimidating. I don't feel qualified. I feel overwhelmed when I think about stepping out and doing what it is that God is asking me to do. And I think sometimes, too, we look at our world and we're like, man, what are we doing in this place and time? And in history, it seems overwhelming, and it seems like it's more challenging and more difficult than ever before. But apparently, God thinks we can handle it because here we are. And so let's be the church and let's be the followers of Christ that He has called us to be. And I want to go back to the first verse of Ephesians chapter 4, which has really been the text for the course of this series. And in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, Paul says, "As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received." Paul starts out by saying, as a prisoner for the Lord, basically, your life is not your own. Our lives are no longer our own. And as those who have been bought, really bought through the blood of Christ, our lives are not our own. So let's live a life that honors what it is that we're called to do and what it is that Jesus did for us and empowers us to do, living a life worthy of the calling. Now, I debunked some of the myths, I hope, the first message about this idea of calling. For many of us, the idea of a calling seems a little overwhelming and a little intimidating, and it's really reserved for famous people and missionaries and pastors and people who are going to do this professionally. But the fact of the matter is, every single follower of Jesus Christ is called. However, don't sit around waiting to discover your calling, and I talked about that. What I think God wants us to do is every day show up and be faithful to whatever it is He's asking you to do in whatever circumstance you find yourself in. And then eventually, as you live a faithful life, your calling will find you. And callings come in many different shapes and sizes. My primary calling is not to be a pastor. It's to be a follower of Jesus, then a husband, then a father, then a grandfather, then a friend, and then a pastor. You have many callings. Just be faithful. And yet many of you are nervous because you don't feel qualified enough or you don't feel good enough. And today, I want us to look at the life of a very, very famous character in the Bible. Not just a character, but a real human being. His name was Moses. You've probably heard of him. If you have been awake and alive for the last 40 or 50 years, even if you didn't grow up in a Christian home, as I didn't grow up in a Christian home, I knew exactly who Moses was. I saw the 10 Commandments. Who didn't see the 10 Commandments? That was an annual event. And we know that Moses was called by God to deliver the Hebrews, the Israelites, from captivity in Egypt. And he, was used by God in a mighty way to bring plagues upon Egypt, upon Pharaoh, to part the Red Sea, and to deliver the Israelites into the promised land, ultimately, after wandering in the desert for 40 years. And Moses is arguably the most famous character in the Old Testament and one of the most famous human beings to ever live life. But he did this against all odds. And we want to talk about that today because for some of you, it seems and feels like to you that for you to live out your calling, it's against all odds that God could possibly use you. Well, you're in good company because Moses felt exactly the same way, and we're going to look at why today. So let's start with how it all started in Exodus chapter 3, verses 10 and 11. And when God showed up to Moses, who was tending sheep in the wilderness, He said something very terrifying to Moses and seemingly very unrealistic to him. He said, "So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" How many times have you, when God has asked you to do something, you're like, whoa, who am I? God, do you really know me? Do you really understand me? Do you understand what I'm thinking and feeling in my past? Which is kind of a rhetorical question because, duh, of course God does. Who am I that I should go? And so for the next 2 chapters, in chapters 4 and 5 of Exodus, we read about Moses trying to talk God out of sending him to Pharaoh and delivering his people. He tries to make all kinds of excuses and all kinds of reasons. And I think part of the reason is because what God was asking Moses to do and his situation didn't line up at all. And I think sometimes we feel the same way, don't we? We're like, God, you're asking me to do this thing, but the situation I'm in right now doesn't line up with what you're asking me to do at all. So now let me kind of fill you in a little bit on why that is. When you picture Moses, how do you envision him? I envision Moses going to deliver the Israelites from Egypt as Russell Crowe in The Gladiator. Don't you? But the fact of the matter was, he was an 80-year-old man who was tending sheep for somebody else. They weren't even his own sheep. He wasn't Russell Crowe in Gladiator. He was 80 years old, and I'm telling you, that was way past your expiration date in those days. And so when God shows up, he's like, maybe 50 years ago, but God, really? Are you serious? My situation, I'm tending sheep, and they're not even my own sheep, and I'm just a humble shepherd, and I'm an old man, and I'm kind of ready to kind of cruise into, the end. And some of you right now are feeling the same way. God, you're asking me to do this, or Denny talks about this stuff, or in church we're called, we're supposed to live a life worthy of our calling, but my situation, my circumstances just won't allow for that to happen. Well, what we're going to see today is that God specializes in impossible situations, as he did with Moses, as he did with Abraham, as he did with Matthew, as he did with the Apostle Paul, as he has always done. He's an expert in impossible, he specializes in impossible situations. So now why was it that God was asking Moses to deliver his people? What was happening? Well, remember the story of Joseph and the coat of many colors and how his brothers betrayed him and all that? Well, they ended up really being a very prominent part of Egypt because Joseph found favor with Pharaoh. And so the Israelites the Hebrews moved in and were part of the Egyptian culture, and they started multiplying like rabbits. I mean, they were growing and growing and growing in number. If you read earlier in Exodus, and you realize that this became a real positive thing at first, but then it became a threat to Pharaoh. He's thinking, if these people keep growing, if they keep multiplying like they are, they're gonna take us over. So we got to put a stop to this. So first he turned them into slaves, thinking this would squelch that, and it didn't. It just multiplied it that much more. So he came up with a very brilliant idea. He goes, well, I'll tell you what, let's do this. Since they're growing at such a rapid rate, anytime a Hebrew male child is born, he must be killed immediately and then reported to the government. That's brutal. And you know the story of the Passover and all that. So this is where Moses enters into the picture, because what happens next is against all odds. In Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, we see this decree. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Now, the Nile River is not like the Tippy River. The Nile River, picture more the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, it's huge. And so you put this little Hebrew baby in a little basket because you're desperate. You put him in the water just hoping and praying against all odds that he ends up okay. And what happens next defies all odds. And we pick it up in verse 5 of Exodus chapter 2. Then Pharaoh's daughter, of all people, Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said, which by all means should have meant the end of this child's life. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." Have you ever thought about that? Of all the people that happen to be there when this child goes floating by in a basket, it happens to be Pharaoh's daughter. What are the odds of that happening? I would suggest, humanly speaking, they're impossible odds, yet God knew exactly what he was doing. And I think there are 3 takeaways from Moses' story that I hope can encourage each of us when we feel that our life is stacking up and what God is calling us to do does not line up with our situation. And for us to be able to live out our calling, it defies all odds, because there's no way that God could overcome this in my life. What are the odds? What are the odds that God could use you in your current circumstances? What are the odds that God could use you with your past? What are the odds that God could use you with your weaknesses? And for some of you, you've already disqualified yourselves from being useful to God because it's humanly impossible. But God specializes in the impossible. And so the first takeaway from Moses' story is this: there is no situation on earth that God cannot turn around. There's no situation on earth that God can't turn around. We know what God did with Moses. It was impossible. So why is it so hard for you to imagine that God could do the same thing with your situation? Some of you are going, "Well, yeah, come on, Denny, you don't understand my situation." And you're right, I don't understand your situation. But God does. And there's not a situation that God can't turn around. There's not a situation that God can't use. Maybe you've given up on it because of your current circumstances, your current situation, but God hasn't. And then as we think about Moses, there's a second takeaway. Not only is there no situation that God can't turn around, there is no past that God can't redeem. Some of you are going, "Well, yeah, but if you knew my past, Denny, doesn't matter what I know or what I think, God already knows your past. He's been with you your whole life. And he's not intimidated by that." In Exodus 2, verses 11 through 15, it didn't scare God away from Moses with Moses' past. Look at where Moses finds himself when God finds him. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. This is when he was still living in the Pharaoh's palace. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he knew that he was Hebrew. He knew his heritage, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one. Now, this is maybe where he looked like Russell Crowe in Gladiator, okay? This was earlier in his life. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. So, not only is Moses an 80-year-old Hebrew shepherd who's tending someone else's flock, but he's on the run from Pharaoh because he murdered an Egyptian. He had a past, and he almost let it disqualify him. This is why he's telling God, he's like, "God, you can't use me. You can't use me. Look at my circumstances. I'm an 80-year-old man out here in the desert. I'm too old for this. You can't use me because I'm an 80-year-old man out here in the desert who's running from Pharaoh, and as soon as he lays eyes on me, I'm dead. Because I murdered an Egyptian. Did you remember that, God? Were you there? Did you see it? How about you? Have you already disqualified yourself from what it is that God is asking you to do because of your past? Okay, God, because of my past, there's no way that you could ever use me. Because some of you have already disqualified yourself. You're like, I'm not good enough. I've got a past. My circumstances won't allow it. I get it. Can you imagine how ridiculous I felt when I felt God calling me to be a pastor? It was ridiculous. I was a terrible student and not a very good boy. And I'm kind of going, if you were to pick out like 10 other people right here, I would be maybe 10th on the list of guys that you would pick out to be a pastor. And everything in me wanted to kind of disqualify myself like this is some kind of joke, or I'm delusional. Have you ever thought of yourself as delusional? That's a scary place to be in your own head. Like, I must be delusional to think that I could be a pastor, to think that God would really call me. And for some of you, you've disqualified yourselves already. Well, God couldn't use me because of my past, because of this, because of that. And you're like Moses, you're making one excuse after another. But here's the deal. I don't know what you've done, and I don't know what has been done to you, but it doesn't matter to God. And it won't stop him from pursuing you. I mean, Paul kind of got that before he came to Christ. He was murdering Christians. Look at what he writes in 2 Corinthians 5, verses 17 and 18. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, it's not what you can do, but it's what Christ can do in you. If anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone. The new is here. All of this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ, then gave us a ministry of reconciliation. So there's no situation God can't turn around. There's no past that God cannot redeem. And our third takeaway from the story of Moses is this, and this is what you need to hear. There is no person that God can't use. Exodus 4:10. Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." Moses had a stuttering problem. And he's saying, God, you want me to go like deliver the people? You want me to go and address Pharaoh? I stutter. Haven't you noticed that? And I think what really Moses, underneath all that, if I could think for him a little bit, because I do the same thing, it's like, God, if you really want to use me to deliver your people from captivity in Egypt, then you're going to have to fix my weakness. You're going to have to make me a better speaker. You're going to have to heal my stuttering problem. And isn't that just like us? To think that before God can use us, he has to take away our weaknesses. Really? And so we make excuses. Well, you can't use me because until you fix this. You can't use me until I get better at that, or you can't use me until I'm healed from this or that. When Moses said, God, I stutter, you got to take away my weakness before you can use me. You know what God said? No. 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 You will be a deliverer who stutters. Paul got this, and he's speaking to us. In 2 Corinthians again, in chapter 5, verse 17, Paul, who wrote over half the New Testament, said, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. We don't know exactly what that is. Scholars have been debating that forever. And this is where the term "a thorn in my flesh" comes from. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in my weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, and difficulties. For when I am weak, I am strong. How awesome is that? So you start walking in your weaknesses and watch God's power come to life. You see, when you think you've got it, when you think you're good enough and strong enough and capable enough, you basically do it yourself, and you never allow God's power to win the day. So live a life worthy of your calling, even if you don't feel worthy. So remember, there's no situation that God can't turn around. There's no past that God can't redeem. There's no person that God can't use. This week has been a ride for me. It started last Sunday with our baptisms. Wow. Was that amazing? Was that amazing? In between services, when I went up to my office to change into dry clothes so I could eventually change back into wet clothes, I just walked into my office and I just cried. I just cried because I couldn't believe that I got to be a part of that. I was overwhelmed with this feeling of kind of what Nick had talked about, that Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not stand against it. And more recently, I've just been overwhelmed with gratitude to God because I get to do this against all odds. Growing up in an agnostic home, with an alcoholic father and a philandering mother. Parents who couldn't keep jobs and who filed bankruptcy more than once. And a family that I was often embarrassed by as a student who was poor in school. As a kid who was very wild and a very wild child, growing up in a blue-collar, largely German Catholic neighborhood, what are the odds that God would call me to do this? And more I've been feeling the sense of, why have I thought all of these years that I've really had anything to do with this except just to show up and be faithful? And that's just hit me hard. And this is the part that I was like, I'm still going, well, I'm going to talk about it. Because it was so powerful. Last week I got asked to do a memorial service for a young 20-year-old man with severe developmental disabilities who goes to our church, who has grown up here. Many of you might know Charlie Sparks. I still envision him over here almost every Sunday worshiping with words that were unintelligible. With all of his challenges and his disabilities. And sometimes I would wonder, what are people thinking? And then after worship, and I mean, if he was physically capable of climbing up on the stage to worship, he would have done it. Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. And then after the worship was over, he'd sit here with either his mom or his dad or his caretaker, and sometimes he would just be a little over-exuberant when I was preaching, with words beyond intelligent understanding. And I would wonder, are people distracted? What are they thinking? And every time I thought that, God would go, whoa, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Don't go there. So he died last Monday. And I was asked if I would do the memorial service Friday night. And something inside of me didn't hesitate. I said, yep. I didn't even look at my calendar. I didn't know what was scheduled, but I knew that I was supposed to do that. And so we had it downstairs because, we had the women's retreat here yesterday and had all this set up. And we were thinking 30, 40 people, maybe. Charlie, 20 years old, severely disabled, according to the world. I mean, how many people are going to show up at his funeral, right? We probably had 100 chairs set up. And we had at least double or triple that amount of people here. I've never seen that room fuller, and the lower parking lot was filled with cars when I left. One story after another story after another story of people who had been his caregivers or been involved in his life as teachers or whatever. They would stand and they would talk about Charlie and how he had changed them. And I had this message all prepared about, how our broken bodies are free and all that. And when it was my turn to speak, I'm like, God, what do I have to say? All I can do is screw this moment up. And all I could think of when I walked up to speak was 1 Corinthians chapter 1. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. And all I could think of was, over the years, when I would see this young man struggling to worship with all of his heart, and then responding to my sermons like no one I've ever had sit out here respond to them, all I could think of was, that was the most perfect soul I think I've ever seen. And the world says he's just handicapped. His life doesn't really amount to much. What good did he do? And yet, is it possible that he's the normal one in God's economy? I sometimes think, why don't I worship like that? And story after story of how he would just go up to strangers and he would love to throw his arms around their neck and just smile and love them and drag them to the ground with love. And how when he went to Magical Meadows, he goes up to this huge horse and he reaches up and he puts his hands in the nostrils of this horse and pulls. And the horse just stood there. Is it possible that to God, that's the perfect picture of a perfect soul? I walked away Friday night completely humbled and completely blown away. I didn't expect it at all. It was just one more way of God going, hey, I got this. I know what I'm doing. Just show up and just be faithful. I think that's all he asks of us. And he'll do the rest. I mean, read the Bible. That's all he's ever done. He had a guy named Noah build a boat in the middle of the desert. Foolish. Had an older couple, barren, Abraham and Sarah, have a baby that would start the lineage of Jesus. Moses, and we talked about him today. Matthew, a tax collector who betrayed his own people, who wrote the first of the 4 Gospels. Paul, a murderer of Christians, changed the world. But most of all, God himself came in the most humble of circumstances. And today there are billions of people who follow him. So if you don't think God can use you, you're wrong. You're wrong. So live a life worthy of your calling, which is to be faithful, show up, and then let God do what only God can do. Heavenly Father, I continue to be amazed at what you teach me. Sometimes thinking, I'm this experienced pastor, this church leader who, knows the Bible and different things like that, and yet you continue to show me in the most unusual and humbling ways what your kingdom really looks like. And most days it doesn't look like what I think it should look like. It looks far different and far better. So God, may we as a church simply put aside our pride, put aside our insecurities, lay aside our pasts, our circumstances, our situations, our weaknesses, and just make ourselves available to you so that you can do in us what you dream of doing in us. In Jesus' name and for his glory and honor.